Hi there, I'm Wendy and welcome to my channel. This video is one of my beginner series and today I'm going to show you how to start working from a straight foundation chain and working a straight piece to then put together to make this bobble hat type egg cozy. So we're using UK crochet stitches and we'll be using the UK treble stitch, but if you're using American stitch terms, this is known as the USA double crochet stitch. So I'm going to take you step by step right through making the first 4 rounds. I'm then going to show you at the end how to crochet your work together to create the seam, and then we're also going to make this little bobble to go on the top of your hat afterwards too. I will also put the start times of each row and each section for you in the description box below, so that when you come back to this video you can see exactly the right point to go back to. So we're going to now take a look at the materials that we're going to need and then we can get going. Today we're going to be using some UK weight acrylic double knitting yarn, a 4mm crochet hook, a pair of scissors, a wool type darning needle, a tape measure or a ruler for measuring the finished length of your work. You're going to need a fork to make the pom-pom, and then finally you're going to need to have a couple of stitch markers. Now you'll want the open-ended type, either the split pin type or the padlock, but if you don't have those you can just use a scrap of yarn, and I'm going to show you how to use a scrap of yarn as a stitch marker in your work now. If you're using a scrap of yarn instead of a pre-made stitch marker, all you need to do is pop your hook through one side of the stitch, and then you're going to take your little piece of yarn, pop it in your hook, and then just pull your hook back through the stitch. And then you can simply use that as the stitch marker instead. Just before we start, this is the right-handed video, so if you're left-handed I'm going to put a link in above here now and in the description box below to take you to the left-handed video. Now the first thing I'm going to do is make my slip knot. So if you already know how to make a flexible loop, that's fine, you can just go ahead and make it in your own preferred way. I'm just going to show you one way that I do mine, and I have the yarn laying across my fingers with the end of the yarn, which is called the tail end, going to the outer edge of my little finger. And I just then hold it in place with my thumb, and then I have the yarn that's going to the ball of wool going across the top of my fingers, and I just wrap it around the first 2 and take it over to form a cross, and then hold that in place with my thumb. Then I take the yarn around the top of my fingers and underneath and bring it back to that cross and hold it in place again a second time, but this time it's lower down. So the first loop around my fingers is the top loop, and the second loop that I made is the lower loop. Then I take my finger or my crochet hook, either is fine, underneath the top loop, grab that lower loop and just pull it up and through, and I hold both ends as I take that loop off my fingers and pull gently, and that creates a flexible loop that can then sit on my crochet hook. So again, if you're already comfortable with making your chains, you can just start making 18 chain, but I'm going to just cover how to go through the initials of making the yarn over movement and making your chain. Now I'm just going to pop my finger on top of the hook to stop it from spinning, and I'm just going to show you the yarn over movement, and that is where the yarn is coming up the back of the hook, over the top of the hook and down the front. So I'll do that again. The yarn comes up the back of the hook, over the top of the hook and down the front, and that is the fundamental movement that you'll be using in every crochet stitch that you make. So I'm now going to carry on. So I'm going to take my hook underneath the yarn, up behind the yarn, and I have this yarn over, grab the chain underneath the hook and then turn my hook down and scoop back through, and again, and I'm just going to have a little count. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so I'm now going to continue until I've got 18 chains. So this is time to hit your pause button, and I'll meet you when you've made those 18 chain on your crochet hook. I've just finished my 18 chain and I'm now ready to start working my first row of trebles. Now I'm going to be missing the first 3 chains because they're going to be standing up representing my first stitch. So that's going to be 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to be working into the side of this 4th chain underneath the hook. Okay, so you're going to miss the first 3 and you're going to work into the side of the 4th chain. Now you want to make sure that your yarn is at the back of your chain. You don't want the yarn lying in front of your chain like that. So make sure the yarn is to the back, and then we can make our yarn over the hook and work into that 4th stitch. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3. That's the 4th chain. Now I'm going to make that yarn over movement and then make sure again that my yarn is behind my chain, and then I'm going to pop my hook from front to back through the side of that 4th chain, and then I'm going to bring the yarn up the back of the hook over the top and down the front again, and it sort of flops into position. It's a bit of a funny one. And then I can draw the hook back through with that yarn, and I've got 3 stitches on my hook. Then I'm going to take the yarn over the hook again. That's another yarn over made. Turn my hook downwards and scoop it back through the first 2, and then make that yarn over the hook again, and then scoop that hook back through the last 2, and I've made my first treble. Now when you look at it, you can put your fingers between that and the 3 chain that you just made. So there's my 3 chain here. And every time you make a stitch, if you look underneath your hook, you will have a V, just like when you were making your chain, and that represents your first stitch. So with this 3 chain that we had at the side here, I'm just going to pop a stitch marker in the 3rd one I made. So that is there. And that chain is directly behind that V that's underneath the hook. So if you can see, I had that 1, 2, 3 chain I made, and I've got that 1, 2, 3 chain that I missed before making my treble, and then this is my treble. So now we're going to make another treble. So it's a yarn over movement, that yarn over the hook, and the yarn to the back of the work is behind my chain, and then the hook is going to go from front to back through the side of the next V, yarn over the hook, pull that hook back through, and I've got 3 stitches on my hook, yarn over the hook, and now I draw back through the first 2, and then yarn over the hook and draw back through the second 2. And now I've made 2 trebles. So again, yarn over the hook, and then I go through the side of the next V, yarn over the hook, draw back through, and I've got 3 stitches on my hook, yarn over the hook, draw back through the first 2 stitches, yarn over the hook, and draw through the last 2 stitches. Okay, so we're starting with 1 stitch on our hook, and then we increase up to 3, and then we're bringing it back down to 1. So I'll do it again. It's yarn over the hook, take the hook through from front to back through the side of the next V, yarn over the hook and draw back through, and we've now increased to 3 stitches on our hook, and that's the first half of the stitch made. Yarn over the hook and draw back through the first 2, yarn over the hook and draw back through the last 2, and that's another treble made. So now again it's time to hit that pause button and continue working all the way along till you get to the end of the row. And what you want to have is you want to end up having 15 of these treble stitches, and you should be able to put your fingers between them so you can tell, and you'll have the V's running along the top. So you're going to have 15 stitches, and then you're going to have this 3 chain at the very side here. and that 3 chain is representing the first stitch. So that 3 chain and the 15 stitches all together will give you 16 in total. So I'll see you at the end of the row. So I've now got to the end of the row, and I'm just taking my hook out simply to show you that I've got my 15 trebles. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and then I have my 3 chain at the side here with the stitch marker in it. So we now want to make 3 chains. So I'm going to pop my hook back in. So that's 1, 2, and 3. And now I can turn my work, and that 3 chain that I've made, that's going to stand up and pretend to be the first treble of the row. So I've made this 3 chain, and I'm going to miss this very first stitch in the row, which I'm just going to put my hook through and show you the V. So I've got the 3 chain underneath my hook, 1, 2, 3, and then the first stitch of the row, I'm going to ignore that because this 3 chain is pretending to be the treble that would have come out of it. And I'm going to make my first treble now in the second V along. So in actual fact, if I'm counting from under the hook, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's the 5th V from underneath the hook. So the yarn is over the hook. The yarn is now at the back of my work, and I'm going to put the hook through both sides of that V. Okay, now the yarn comes over the hook, and I pull the hook back through to the front, and I've got 3 stitches on my hook. Yarn goes over the hook, and then I draw back through the first 2, and then the yarn goes over the hook again, and I draw back through the last 2. So now I've got this first treble that I've made with the V stitch behind it, and I've got this 3 chain at the side. So again, I'm going to put my stitch marker in that 3rd chain that I made, which is here. So if you look at it again, I've got the V with the stitch that I've just made here, and then I've got my 3 chain at the side, and I've got this stitch marker in the 3rd of the 3 chain that I made. All right, and this is quite important because this will guide us now. We're going to be zigzagging this all the way up our work, because this will show us where the end stitch in each row is, and it will help us maintain the right amount of stitches as we're working our rows. So I'm going to make another treble now. So my yarn is at the back of my work. It's not in front of my work, it's at the back here. And then I'm going to make the yarn over, and I'm going to go through both sides of the V. Okay, so I've got that there, yarn over the hook, draw back through to the front, and I've got 3 stitches on the hook. So the first half of my stitch is made. And now I'm going to take the yarn over the hook and draw back through the first 2, and yarn over the hook and draw back through the last one. So again, one more, yarn over the hook, through both sides of the V, yarn over the hook, draw back through to the front, yarn over the hook, draw back through the first 2, yarn over the hook, and draw back through the last 2. So we're going to continue that all the way until we get to the last stitch. So it's time to hit that pause button again, and I'm going to meet you when we get back to the stitch just before the stitch marker. So I've now reached the end of my row, and I finished at the stitch just before the stitch marker. And if you remember, we placed the stitch marker in the top of the 3 chain that was representing our first stitch in the row. So I know that this is where I need to make my last treble in this row. So I'm just going to take the yarn over the hook, and I'm going to place it through where that stitch marker was, and I can take that stitch marker now out, and I can now just finish off making my treble. So it's yarn over the hook and pull back to 3, and then yarn over the hook, pull back to 2, yarn over the hook, pull back to 1. And that's our second row now complete, and we're now ready to make our third row. So again, I'm going to make 3 chain and turn. Just before we start our next row, we're just going to take a little look at our work, because this will help us gain an understanding of keeping the edges of our rows straight. So I've got my 3 chain here, which is standing up nicely, representing the first treble in the row. And if I have a look at it from the top, I can see my 3 V's here. 1, 2, 3, the 3 V's that make up the chain. So as this is representing that first treble, we're going to miss the first stitch in the row, which is actually the 4th V from the hook. So 1, 2, 3, miss that first stitch in the row, which is the 4th V from the hook, and we're going to work into the next one. So we keep our yarn to the back of our work, yarn over the hook, through both sides of the stitch, yarn over the hook, pull back through to the front, that's the first half of our stitch made, yarn over the hook, pull back through the first 2, yarn over the hook, and pull back through the last 2. So now we can see that we've got our treble that we've just made here, and we've got our 3 chain to the side. So again, if we look at it top on, we've got the V here from the stitch we've just made, and the V immediately behind it is the top of the 3 chain that we made. I'm going to pop my stitch marker in the top of the 3 chain that was made. So there we go. So I've got 1, 2, 3 that I made at the beginning of the row, and now I'm going to continue until I reach the stitch marker at the other end, so making my trebles in the top of both sides of each V. So I'll do one more, yarn over the hook, hook through both sides of the V, yarn over the hook, pull back through, and I've got 3 stitches on my hook. That's the first half of the stitch made, yarn over the hook, pull back through the first 2, yarn over the hook, pull back through the last 2. So it's time to hit that pause button, and I will meet you back at the last stitch just before the stitch marker at the end of the row. So now, as you can see, I've got back to the end of the row, and I've got the next stitch is the 3 chain with the stitch marker in it. So I know this is going to be the last treble that I'm making in my row in the same point where I placed that stitch marker. So it's yarn over the hook through the same spot where the stitch marker is, and then you can either leave the stitch marker in or take it out at that point, that's up to you. And then it's yarn over the hook and pull back through to 3, and that's the first half of the stitch made, yarn over the hook, pull back to 2, yarn over the hook and pull back to 1, and we're ready to turn again. So it's make 3 chain, turn our work, miss the 3 chain that we made and the first stitch of the row, and we're going to work our first treble into the second stitch in the row below. So it's yarn over the hook through both sides of the stitch, yarn over the hook, pull back through to the front, and we've got 3 stitches on our hook, yarn over the hook, pull back to 2, yarn over the hook, pull back to 1. And then we've got our treble that we've just made with a V sitting on top of it, and then to the side here we've got the 3 chain that we just made. So again, I'm going to put my stitch marker in the top of the 3 chain that I just made. And so if you're looking at it from the top, again, you've got this V that you've just made from the first treble here, and then the chain immediately behind it, the V, is the top of the 3 chain, and the stitch marker is there. So now I'm going to continue all the way along, and when I get to the end, I'm going to make my last stitch where the last stitch marker is. So again, hit that pause button, and I'm going to see you at the end of the row. Okay, so again, I finished at the stitch just before the chain where my stitch marker is inserted, and now at this point, as I said, you can either take your stitch marker out or start to make your stitch first. So I'm going to make my last treble in the same point where the stitch marker was inserted. So this time I'm just going to take mine out because I can see quite clearly where I want to make my stitch. So I've just made that last treble in the top of the 3 chain from the row below, and I'm ready again to make 3 chain, turn my work, miss the 3 chain that I've made and the first stitch in the row. So if I'm counting the V's, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I'm going to make my first treble in the next stitch through both sides of the stitch, and then take a quick look at my work, and I've got my treble here with the V in the top, and then if I look at the second V from the hook, that is the top of my 3 chain, and I'm going to pop my stitch marker in, and that will mark the end of the next row for me. So I'm going to repeat this, zigzagging basically, with these 2 stitch markers, taking them all the way up to mark the end of the row, and this will really help me keep the edges of my rows straight. So you just want to continue working this way until your work reaches about 6.5 inches, and that is 17 centimeters. For me, it was 16 rows, but bear in mind that when you first learn to crochet, everyone's tension varies a little bit, so you might need a couple of rows more or a couple of rows less. I'll also put the timing for the next part of the video, which is going to be joining up this back seam, in the description box below, so that if you want to come back to this when you've finished working your crochet, you can go exactly to the right point. So I'll see you at the other side. So I've now worked my 6.5 inches, which was 17 centimeters. I've cut my yarn at about 4 inches long, which again is about 10 centimeters in length. And I'm going to make one last yarn over the hook and draw that hook back through, and then just flick the yarn off. And my work is now complete, and I'm ready to join the upper edge and the lower edge to join the back seam together. Now I'm going to double crochet mine together, but you can sew it together if you prefer, and I'm going to use a different colour thread so you can see what I'm doing. So I've got these 2 edges, and I'm going to pop my hook through one side of the bottom corner and then through both sides of the stitch on the upper edge, and I'm going to just pop my yarn in, leaving enough yarn to sew in afterwards. So I'm going to pop that yarn in the hook, pull it through to the front, and then I'm going to make 1 chain just to secure it. Now, quite simply, I'm going to be working a row of double crochet stitches going through both layers. So I'm going to go through 1 stitch at the bottom edge, and then 1 stitch at the top edge, going through both sides of the V, and then it's yarn over the hook, pull the hook all the way through to the front, and I've got 2 stitches on my hook, yarn over the hook and pull through to 1. So then I'm going to go through the next stitch at the lower edge, and then the next stitch with both sides of the V on the upper edge, yarn over the hook and pull through both layers, and I've got 2 stitches on my hook, yarn over the hook and pull through to 1. So move on to the next stitch in the lower edge, and then go to the back of the work and go through the next layer of the upper edge, yarn over the hook, pull back through to the front, 2 stitches on my hook, yarn over the hook and pull back to 1. So I'll do one more to show you. Go through the stitch at the lower edge and then through both sides of the stitch on the upper edge. So I've got these 2 layers, yarn over the hook, pull back through the 2, yarn over the hook and pull back to 1. So I'm going to continue in this manner until I've completed my seam. Now when it comes to finishing off this time, I'm going to leave quite a long end so that I've got enough yarn to sew in afterwards. So I've left a good 12 inches there, and I'm going to make a yarn over and just flick it through and flick it all the way off. And that's my back seam completed. This is also the standard way that you would join granny squares together as well, so it's quite a handy thing to learn. So, and then turn it inside out, and you can see I've got these little ridges, like this little ladder going all the way up, but that's absolutely fine. You wouldn't see that at all if it was in the same colour as your main yarn. So I'm going to use this long end now and thread a needle through it. And then I'm just going to run this needle through the edge, one of the edges, one of the side edges of my work, just doing little running stitches, catching it where I can. And then when I get back to the beginning, I can give that a good tug. And then I'm going to do an overstitch and then catch my yarn through it to secure it. And then I'm going to go around again and try and pull it a little bit tighter. I don't want to pull it so tight that I'm going to break my yarn, but I want to pull it tight enough to gather in the top at that upper edge. Okay, and then do a couple of little over sewing stitches, and then I'm just going to lose that in that back seam. I'm just going to thread that needle through a few stitches, and I can trim that off. And then again with these spare yarns at the other edge, I'm just going to do a little overstitch to secure that end in, and then thread that through. And then the last one, and if you've missed a slight little bit at the edge here, you can just do a little over sewing stitch here and just secure that off. And I've got one spare thread up here, so I'll just finish that. And now all we need to do is to make the little pom-pom to go on the top. So I'm I'm going to turn that the right way out and then turn the brim up. And so we're ready for that little pom-pom now. To make my pom-pom, I've got an ordinary eating fork and I've measured off about 4 meters of yarn, and I'm just going to thread it through the center of the fork, and I'm leaving enough yarn here that I can use to tie around my pom-pom afterwards. So I'm just going to hold that in place, and then I'm going to just start gently winding around the prongs of the fork, allowing enough of a gap underneath here afterwards. So it's going to go around, probably around 40-ish times. So just keep winding it round. And then again with the other end, you want to leave enough of an end that you can wind it around and tie in a knot again afterwards. So I'm just going to thread a darning needle through there, and then I'm going to bring it through and take it through the center prong of the fork, and bring it back up through the middle of the top. And so I've now got 2 ends that I can tie. So I can take my needle out now, and I want to tie it as firmly as I can without breaking the yarn. So it can be a bit tricky when it's actually on the fork. So I tend to tie it on the fork and then tie it again afterwards. So I've tied that together, and then I'm going to take it off the fork like that, and that's my fork finished with. And then I'm going to wrap that yarn around again tightly and tie that in a knot. So hold that together. So I've tied that firmly, and then I'm going to wrap it around again. And tie it in another knot. There we go. And then I'm going to turn it over and wrap it around once more. And tie it one last time. And a double knot. And now I have this little bundle of yarns that I can start snipping through. So this isn't going to give me a perfectly shaped pom-pom. It will need a little bit of trimming up afterwards to get it into a pom-pommy type of shape. But it is great for a quick little way for small projects. So you can of course use a pom-pom maker or any other preferred way that you want to make your pom-poms. But this is just a great little way. So again, leave these 2 strands so that you can pull these through your hat and then give it a little fluff up, and you might find some more that you've missed. So I'm just going to go through and double check. Okay, so now I'm just going to give it a little bit of a tidy up and trim off some of the slightly longer ends. And there we go, and I think that will do. So I'm going to quite simply now take my hat and pop my crochet hook up inside very near to that center where we pulled it all together, and I'm going to hook through one of these longer strands. So that's one done. And then again, I'm going to pop my hook from the inside of the hat to the outside, very near the center again. And I'm going to get the other strand of yarn, and I'm going to hook that through. Okay, and so I can now tie these in place. So again, tie them securely. And then you can either sew in those ends if you want to, or you can just snip them off, leaving about a centimetre spare inside, because that won't matter. And then turn our hat inside out. And that's it, complete. A lovely little bobble now made to go on top of your egg cozy. I really do hope that you've enjoyed this tutorial and making your little bobble hat egg cozy. So just remember to subscribe and hit that bell so that you get notifications when my new videos come out. And if you've enjoyed it, it would be lovely if you gave me a thumbs up. So for now, I'll just say thanks for watching, happy crocheting, and look forward to seeing you soon. Bye!